Spring 2004, Cochise County, Arizona. 5 years into the worst drought since the 1940s. Groundwater levels had dropped more than 100 feet. Irrigation farms were abandoning fields. A University of Arizona scientist named Dr. Chris Morgan had spent 8 years building the most advanced monsoon planting software in the Southwest: satellite data, soil sensors, climate models. His system showed first monsoon rain arriving in 5 to 7 days. He was wrong by 4 days. 4 days in the monsoon planting window means no germination. No germination means no crop. 3 miles away, 64-year-old Maria Runningwater, planted by a petroglyph calendar her ancestors carved 400 years ago. The rain arrived in 31 hours. In 5 years of drought, her harvest never failed once. The petroglyph panel was on the south-facing slope of a basalt outcrop 300 yards from the edge of Maria Runningwater's fields, and she had been reading it since she was 7 years old. Her grandmother had brought her to it for the first time in the spring of 1947, walking her across the rocky desert floor in the early morning light, and had stood beside her while she learned to see what was carved there, not as decoration, not as art, in the way the word was used by people who had not grown up with such things, but as instruction. A calendar, a record of observations so precise and so patient that it had been accumulating accuracy for 4 centuries, tested against the desert's own behavior, every monsoon season, every dry winter, every hungry spring, corrected by each generation of farmers who had staked their survival on the knowledge it encoded. Maria was 64 years old in the spring of 2004, and she had been reading the petroglyph calendar for 57 years. She read it the way a skilled navigator reads the stars, not by translating symbols into abstract data, but by understanding the calendar as a living system, a record of relationship between the desert's rhythms and the human communities that had learned to synchronize with them. The carvings documented what the Tohono O'odham had spent centuries observing, the precise sequence of signs that announced the arrival of the summer monsoon in the Sonoran Desert, the specific cloud formations, the shift in wind direction, the behavior of desert animals, the timing of particular plant flowerings, that together constituted a reliable composite signal for when the 48 to 72-hour planting window before the first monsoon rain was opening. In the spring of 2004, as the 5th consecutive year of historic drought continued to hollow out the aquifers beneath southern Arizona, that knowledge was the most valuable agricultural asset in Cochise County. Dr. Chris Morgan had been told about Maria Runningwater by a colleague at the University of Arizona's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, who had mentioned her in the context of a broader conversation about why certain small, traditional operations in the region appeared to be weathering the 1999 to 2004 drought with a stability that the computer models simply could not account for. Chris was 41 years old, a specialist in arid-land agricultural systems with a particular focus on predictive modeling for monsoon-dependent agriculture in the American Southwest. He used climate data from the National Weather Service, soil moisture sensors, satellite-derived vegetation indices, and a proprietary software platform developed by the university's Agricultural Systems Engineering Group to build forecasting models that helped farmers in the region time their planting decisions to maximize the limited, unpredictable rainfall that the Sonoran Desert provided. The models were good. Chris believed in them. He had spent 8 years refining them, incorporating new data sources and improving their spatial resolution, and they had demonstrably improved planting outcomes for the farms that used them, reducing the rate of failed germination from moisture timing errors by an estimated 23% over conventional calendar-based planting. He was, by any reasonable measure, at the forefront of the science of arid-land agricultural planning in the region. He was also, in the spring of 2004, looking at a 5-year drought of a severity that the USGS would later describe as the worst in Arizona since the early 1940s and possibly earlier, a drought during which the stream flow across virtually every major watershed in the state had collapsed. Groundwater levels had dropped precipitously across the Cochise County basin, and irrigation-dependent agriculture had experienced failures of a scale that no one working in the field had planned for. The farms around Wilcox and Sulphur Springs Valley, some of the most productive irrigated agricultural land in southern Arizona, were pumping from aquifers that were declining at rates that made continued long-term operation mathematically incoherent. Wells that had reliably produced water for decades were going dry or producing at fractions of their previous capacity. Maria Runningwater's fields, 3 miles from the nearest irrigation canal and with no connection to any groundwater pump system, were producing crops. Chris drove to her property on a Tuesday morning in early April, following directions from his colleague at the university that involved several landmarks not marked on any map he possessed. He found the property, 12 acres of desert field, the soil darker and more structured than the surrounding desert floor, bordered by natural vegetation that had been deliberately managed rather than cleared, with a cluster of traditional buildings and structures at the northern edge and the basalt outcrop visible in the distance to the south. He found Maria at the edge of her largest field, crouching at the soil surface with her fingers pressed into the earth, examining something he couldn't see from where he parked his truck. She stood when she heard him approach, and looked at him with the calm, appraising quality that he would come to associate with people whose lives required constant, accurate assessment of conditions, farmers, navigators, anyone whose livelihood depended on reading the environment correctly. "Dr. Morgan," she said. It was not a question. "Miss Runningwater," he said. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward a wooden bench at the field's edge. "I'll tell you what I can tell you." What she told him, that first morning, over the course of 2 hours as the spring sun moved across a sky carrying the characteristic light of a desert still waiting for rain, was structured around a distinction that he found himself turning over in his mind for weeks afterward. The distinction was between farming that worked with the desert's schedule and farming that imposed a different schedule onto the desert. The difference, she said, between someone who had memorized the bus timetable and someone who was trying to make the buses run when they wanted them. The modern irrigation system, she said, is trying to make the bus run when you want it. You bring water from somewhere else, at a time you choose, in an amount you decide. For a long time that works. But you're not working with the desert, you're working against it, and the desert is more patient than any machine. Eventually it wins. Chris looked at the field. The soil surface was covered with a thin mulch of plant material that he recognized as a deliberate moisture retention practice, the accumulation of organic matter that reduced evaporation and kept the shallow soil surface cooler during the brutal summer days that were coming. The field's microgeography was not flat but subtly contoured, directing runoff from the basalt outcrop toward the planting areas in a pattern that his engineering eye identified as intentional water harvesting, passive, gravity-driven, requiring no infrastructure and no energy. "What's your planting schedule?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, as though assessing whether the question was being asked in the right spirit. Then she said, "Come back in 2 months, I'll show you." He came back in June, and then again twice in early July, and it was on his third visit, on a morning that his NWS data and his university's modeling software were indicating a 60 to 70% probability of first monsoon precipitation within the following week, that he found Maria already moving through her fields with seeds. She was planting, not the small supplemental planting of a farmer who hedged her bets, but the primary planting of the season, working with a purpose and an efficiency that indicated she had made a definitive decision rather than a provisional one. "You're planting now," he said, catching up to her at the edge of the second field. "Yes," she said. "My models show 60 to 70% probability of first monsoon within the week. That's good, but it's not certain." She looked at him. "The rain is coming in 2 days. Possibly 3. He pulled out his phone and checked the latest NWS forecast. It showed a front developing over the Gulf of California, consistent with typical monsoon onset dynamics. But the timing models showed a range of 4 to 8 days for the moisture to reach Cochise County at sufficient concentration for significant precipitation. His university's software, which incorporated finer resolution regional terrain data and historical monsoon onset patterns specific to the Sulphur Springs Valley, showed a similar range, 5 to 7 days, with peak probability around day 6. "What makes you think 2 to 3 days?" he asked. She pointed south, toward the basalt outcrop and the Dragoon Mountains behind it. "See the clouds above the mountains this morning?" He looked. There were high, thin cirrus formations visible over the mountain peaks, the kind of upper atmosphere moisture signal that was a necessary but not sufficient condition for monsoon development. "Those have been building for 4 days," she said. "Yesterday evening the wind shifted. You can still smell it this morning, the moisture coming from the southeast. The velvet mesquite along the wash flowered this week, 2 weeks earlier than last year, and the cactus wrens stopped their morning calls at 7 this morning instead of 9. She paused. "None of that is in your model, but it's in the calendar." She turned and continued planting, and Chris stood at the field's edge and watched her and thought about what she had just described, a composite signal system assembled from 4 centuries of systematic observation, each component, cloud formation, timing, wind direction, and smell, plant phenology, animal behavior, representing a correlation between observable condition and subsequent precipitation outcome that had been verified, corrected, and refined across hundreds of monsoon seasons by communities whose survival depended on getting the assessment right. His software used 17 data inputs. What she was describing used a different 17, none of which appeared in any database he had access to. The rain came in 31 hours. It arrived in the late afternoon of the second day after Maria's planting, the characteristic boiling thunderstorm of the Sonoran Desert monsoon, building from the southeast as she had described, the anvil clouds rising to 30,000 feet over the Dragoons before the first lightning struck the mountain ridgeline. By 6 in the evening, the storm was over her fields, delivering what the rain gauge Chris had set up at the field's edge would record as 1.4 inches in 94 minutes, the compressed, intense precipitation of the desert monsoon that was simultaneously insufficient if you weren't prepared for it and transformative if you were. The seeds Maria had planted 48 hours earlier were positioned at exactly the right depth in soil that had been prepared to receive and retain this precise quantity of water. The water harvesting contours of her field directed the runoff toward the planting rows rather than away from them. The organic mulch on the soil surface slowed the water's passage and reduced the flash runoff that, on unprepared ground, would have carried most of that 1.4 inches into the arroyos within an hour of falling. Chris watched the rain fall on Maria's field and ran the numbers in his head. His models had shown peak probability at day 6. The rain had arrived at day 2. The difference, 4 days, was the difference between seeds in the ground and seeds in a bag, between germination and failure, between a crop and a loss. His software had been wrong by a margin that, in monsoon window planting, was not a statistical inconvenience, but a fundamental failure of timing. He called his colleague at the university that evening. "The traditional signal system is better than my model," he said, "not marginally, substantially." His colleague was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." The drought of 1999 to 2004 had been deepening for 5 years by the time of Maria's planting, and its impact on agriculture in Cochise County had been accumulating in ways that the county's agricultural census data would later document in stark terms. Groundwater levels in the Sulphur Springs Valley, one of Arizona's most productive agricultural regions, responsible for significant portions of the state's specialty crop production, had been declining at accelerated rates since 2000, with some wells showing drops of more than 100 feet over the 5-year period. The USGS hydrological assessment, published in 2005, would confirm that the 1999 to 2004 drought was the most severe in Arizona in at least 60 years, with stream flow and major drainages running at 20 to 40% of historical averages for most of the period, and groundwater recharge rates far below extraction rates across the southern basins. For irrigation-dependent agriculture, this translated into a crisis that was simultaneously financial, practical, and existential. Pumping costs increased as well depths grew. Some wells failed entirely. Operations that had assumed reliable groundwater access were discovering that the assumption had been built on a resource that was not, in fact, reliable at the extraction rates the previous decades had normalized. The economic losses across Cochise County's agricultural sector during the drought years were significant, reduced to partial-year operations, abandoned fields, and in some cases permanent closure of operations that had been farming the same land for generations. Maria's 12 acres produced a harvest every year of the drought, not an abundant harvest. The Sonoran Desert monsoon delivered what it delivered, and no amount of traditional knowledge could change the underlying precipitation reality of a severe multi-year drought. What the monsoon window planting system delivered was optimization, the maximum possible yield from the water that did fall, achieved by planting at the precise moment when the soil conditions, the rainfall timing, and the plant's germination requirements were in alignment, and by using seed varieties, primarily Tepary beans, the desert-adapted legume that the Tohono O'odham had cultivated and selected for drought tolerance across centuries of exactly these conditions, that were physiologically matched to the precipitation window the calendar identified. Tepary beans were, in the judgment of plant breeders and agricultural botanists who had studied them, among the most drought-tolerant food crops in existence. Their root systems were capable of accessing soil moisture at depths and with an efficiency that conventional bean varieties could not match. Their germination requirements were precisely calibrated to the brief moisture window of the desert monsoon. They needed that initial burst of intense precipitation to germinate, but once established, they could complete their growth cycle on the residual soil moisture that remained after the storm, supplemented by the smaller subsequent rains of the monsoon season, with a water use efficiency that made them essentially impossible to cultivate profitably under conventional irrigation economics, but extraordinarily well suited to the desert's natural precipitation pattern. The calendar knew this because the people who had maintained it had selected, tested, and refined the varieties across the same 4 centuries during which they had refined the planting window identification. The seeds and the calendar were not separate knowledge systems. They were components of the same integrated agricultural technology, evolved together through centuries of selection pressure that was, at its most fundamental level, the selection pressure of survival. Chris Morgan understood this more clearly with each conversation he had with Maria over the summer of 2004. He visited her fields 8 times between the first monsoon planting in July and the harvest in October, each visit structured around questions he was learning to ask differently than he had asked them before. He was trained to ask, "What are your inputs? What are your outputs? What is your optimization function?" He was learning to ask, instead, "What is the desert doing? What has it always done? And how do you know?" The answers came from the Petroglyph calendar on the basalt outcrop, from the seed varieties in the ceramic storage vessels in Maria's storage room, from the oral knowledge she had received from her grandmother and her grandmother's teachers, and from 57 years of her own direct observation, a personal data set that was both part of the community's long record and distinct from it, the way every generation's contribution was both individual and collective. She took him to the Petroglyph panel on his 4th visit. They walked to it in the morning, when the light was angled correctly to read the carvings without strain, and she stood beside him the way her grandmother had stood beside her in 1947 and explained what she was reading. The carvings were not a single artist's work. They were clearly accumulated across a long period, different hands, leaving different marks in a system of symbols that had maintained its internal consistency, even as individual contributors added to it over generations. The oldest carvings, worn smooth by weather and time, documented the basic structure, the 2 seasons of the Sonoran Desert agricultural year, the monsoon cycle, the relationship between the saguaro fruit harvest, which the O'odham calendar used as the year's beginning, the moment when the saguaro wine ceremony opened the season of planting, and the monsoon arrival that followed. Layered over this foundation were more specific notations, the composite signal indicators that Maria had described to Chris on his first visit, encoded in a visual vocabulary that she translated as she pointed to each element. Wind direction symbols, cloud formation indicators, plant phenology markers corresponding to specific species, the velvet mesquite flowering, the desert willow bloom, the behavior of particular bird species. Each element in the composite signal was represented, along with notations that indicated the relationship between that element's observation and the timing of monsoon onset that had been recorded across the calendar's history. "How accurate is it?" Chris asked. He meant the question technically, in the way his training had taught him to ask it. What is the prediction error? What is the confidence interval? Maria considered how to answer. "In the 57 years I have been using it," she said finally, "I have planted within the window 23 times. 23 times. The first significant rain came within 72 hours of planting. 3 times I was early. The rain came 4 or 5 days later. Once I was late, the rain came before I finished planting. Of the 23 times I planted within the window, 21 produced crops." Chris did the math. Out of 27 planting seasons, 21 had produced successful crops using the monsoon window method, a success rate of 78%, in conditions where the alternative approach, conventional calendar-based planting, would have produced reliable germination perhaps 40 to 50% of the time in drought years. And his model, which he had believed was better than calendar-based planting, had missed the first monsoon of 2004 by 4 days. "Does it account for drought years specifically?" he asked. "Years when the monsoon is weaker or later than normal?" "The calendar is most useful in years like this one," Maria said. "When the monsoon is uncertain, weak or late, the window is narrow. There may only be one real opportunity in the whole season. If you plant too early, the seeds are in dry ground when the rain finally comes and the germination is poor. If you plant too late, the season is too short for the crop to mature. The window the calendar identifies is not the only window, it's the best window. In a normal year, that distinction matters less. In a drought year, it's everything." This was the insight that Chris would spend the next several years trying to translate into the language of his professional community. The idea that the traditional knowledge system was not merely a lower-tech version of what his models were doing, but a system that had been optimized for the exact conditions under which modern technological approaches were least reliable. His software performed reasonably well in normal years and degraded in accuracy during drought conditions, when the monsoon's behavior became more variable and less predictable by the statistical methods the model used. The Petroglyph calendar signal system, built from 400 years of observation that included many drought years, was most informative precisely when the technological system was least informative. They were not competing tools for the same task. They were complementary systems whose strengths and weaknesses were inverted relative to each other. Chris submitted a research proposal to the University of Arizona's Office of Research and Development in the autumn of 2004, proposing a collaborative study with the Tohono O'odham Nation to systematically document and analyze the traditional monsoon window planting knowledge and compare its predictive accuracy with current computational modeling approaches. The proposal went through 2 rounds of revision. The university's institutional review process for research involving Indigenous communities required consultation and co-design protocols that Chris had not initially built into his methodology, before being approved with a formal partnership agreement that gave the Tohono O'odham Nation's Leadership Council co-investigator status and veto authority over any publication of sensitive traditional knowledge. The negotiation of that agreement